continuing coverage from the SABC's actual base of coverage of G20 Summit 2025, the first one on African soil. As Bongo was saying, we're waiting now to see the Canadian Prime Minister disembark from this aircraft. I'm Tembekile Mkhototo with coverage from Nasrec this evening, joined by SABC News specialist correspondent Sophie Mugwena. And Sophie, the arrival of Mark Carney is key because he sits at the moment at the helm of the G7 gathering.
You are correct. He's currently the chair of the G7. The G7 is those powerful nations, the most industrialized nations. We know that it was a G8, and that group now is called G7 because Russia was expelled from the G8. But the relationship between the G7 and the African continent dates back to the launch of the African Union. When the African Union decided to have a program, a blueprint to develop the continent, NEPAD, the leaders of the AU took a decision to present NEPAD before the heads of state and government of the G7, so that when the G7 countries engage Africa, they have a document on the table. And therefore, it is quite an important group. Right. Secondly, those G7 member states are also members of the G20. Right. And all the time when you have the G7 meeting, the host invites South Africa. Even now, recently, the Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola, participated during the outreach program of the G7 recently, and therefore it speaks to the relationship. But also, the Prime Minister of Canada was very clear that he is supporting South Africa as it is now currently hosting the G20. And therefore, when you have the United Kingdom supporting South Africa, behind the scenes, the UK has done a lot of work to ensure that member states of the G20, they speak in one voice. And when there were also some background discussions around handing over of the G20 and not handing over of the G20, the United Kingdom played a very, very crucial part in terms of assisting South Africa. So the Canada now here, you have a formidable force. And
I think, Sophie, just that's a good point to stop it, because we're seeing another aircraft landing, so it's a busy night at our airports. I'm told we're getting the Saudi representatives, the delegation arriving. They will be led by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a key player when you consider the situation in the Middle East at the moment. The Saudis, the US very much wants them to recognize the state of Israel, form a better relationship, but they simply refuse to do that without an independent state for the Palestinians.
And you'd recall, he was in the United States of America. We saw that almost like a state visit, pumping ceremony, the dinner, where Elon Musk even was invited at the dinner, because Saudi Arabia is quite important. It's a Gulf nation, and also the oil there. And we saw even President Trump visiting the Gulf region. Saudi was on his itinerary. And therefore, from the United States of America to South Africa, what a coincidence.
And given that context, I wonder if this is an awkward meeting for people or countries like the Saudis, the UK, Canada, who want good relations with the United States, but also want a great relationship with South Africa, yet Washington and Pretoria are simply not getting along at the moment.
Well, you know, in diplomacy, you always find a way you navigate your terrain when there are these kinds of tensions. South Africa, at times, finds itself in a crossfire in most cases because of its policy, or the foreign policy of being pursuing a peaceful continent and a peaceful world. So you'll see countries that are fighting, but they are all friends with South Africa or engaging South Africa. Let's take the war in Ukraine. Both President Zelensky and President Putin, they do speak to President Ramaphosa, that is South Africa. And therefore, in this situation, this challenge of US and South Africa doesn't stop other countries to continue to engage both the United States of America and South Africa. That's why I'm saying what we don't often tell is stories behind the story? Who is assisting South Africa to navigate the US question as it relates to the G20? It's countries such as the UK. So they always find a way.
It's a complicated, complex picture, right, where everything is almost intertwined. And I was joking earlier about how much traffic we're seeing at the airports. So right now, we're waiting to see the Canadian PM, Mark Carney, right? We're waiting to see the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, arrive. But we also have, in fact, on the tarmac, elsewhere, we're watching visuals of the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. That's from the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who's also going to be in the country for the G20. So no shortage of powerful figures in the room. How does the G20 begin to navigate the different interests from different parts of the world, but also individual states?
I think the fact that they came in numbers, you're talking about the Gulf now descending into our shores. You have the United Arab Emirates,
the
Saudis, and we expect Nigeria, another oil country, to arrive. The president of Nigeria, very soon you'll see his plane. And therefore it speaks to how leaders in the world, some of them, do understand that you have to work together, no matter what, no matter your views. But at the end of the day, in the interest of building a better world, you have to work together. Because all the countries at this juncture are in crisis in terms of socio-economic conditions of their citizens. And you can't be an island. All countries are grappling with economic challenges, unemployment, health issues. COVID taught us that if you don't work together, you will all perish. And I think that lesson is now being applied in terms of groups and powerful nations working together.
And on that point, Sophie, I think it gives us an opportunity to pause for a moment and reflect on the mandate, right, of the G20, because you reference the issues around the economy a lot, because that's what it was initially founded to do in the late 90s after the financial crisis of 1997, 1998, and then it expanded. What can it do realistically in terms of everything that's going on in the world?
I think the G20, it's a forum. And the role of this forum, they shouldn't deviate to the core mandate of ensuring that the world doesn't find itself again in a financial crisis. They must continue to be on a lookout for early warning systems. And therefore, the finance track must be vigilant, and they must be visible and very effective. Two, the other stream that deals with political matters, because these political matters are affecting the global economy, prosperity, peace and security, they must do the same. And therefore, much as at times you see a situation, a host decides to broaden the mandate, the issue is how do you broaden it but still ensure that you consolidate. And that will be the responsibility of the host country to ensure that there are so many issues and interests, but we are not going to veer off the road. Here are the critical issues. And I think the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, the UN boss, gave a direction to these leaders that I am here, I'm the UN chief, here are the challenges in the world. Can you please pay attention to this and implement? So it's up to the leaders to listen, because what Guterres spoke about, it's on the agenda of the summit. That's why he credited South Africa for ensuring that in the agenda you have real pressing issues.
And is the absence then of the United States in the room during the meetings, is that going to be to the benefit or to the detriment of the discussions? Because the final declaration is what we're now waiting to see. You were telling us earlier that, in fact, progress is being made in agreeing on one.
Well, it depends where you stand on this issue. America not being in the room can assist because you can reach consensus. America not being in the room can lead to a situation where you have challenges with continuity. But I want to go back to the United Kingdom. Remember, you have a Troika. So if America derails the declaration, Johannesburg Declaration, you have the United Kingdom, a Troika member, the incoming in 2027, who can pick up the baton and put the pieces together so that you continue. Therefore, I think because of Troika and the fact that much as now the summit is starting the cycle, because it ends now with the developing South,
Right.
South Africa, it's going back to the developed North. United Kingdom can save the situation when it takes over in 2027. So it depends where you stand. Of course, you must expect drama next year with the host being very unpredictable.
And I want to actually bring up, let's go back to those pictures. In fact, while we were talking, we're waiting to see the arrival. President Macron of France, in fact, I'm told, is speaking at one of the G20 engagements. Let's bring up those visuals of President Macron and hear what the French have to say.
La liberté du peuple sud-africain, ce combat, s'il fut d'abord celui des Sud-Africains, a vite dépassé les frontières. Combat contre l'apartheid, l'inhumanité, la barbarie, combat pour unir les femmes et les hommes et les peuples entre eux, combat plus difficile encore une fois l'apartheid révoqué contre la vengeance ou l'oubli. Combat qui unit des femmes et des hommes à travers le monde, portés par une même exigence de justice et de dignité.
Yet up on those remarks by the French President Emmanuel Macron. If you're well versed in France or in French, we would have needed you tonight to help us wade through some of what he's saying. But Macron is a key player when you look at global politics, what's happening in the EU. Very little shifts without the involvement of the French. So when we have that translation up, we'll bring it up for you. But Sophie, let's talk about Emmanuel Macron and his role in geopolitics and the G20 specifically, because the French are important.
The French are very important, and I think South Africa has had a very cordial relationship with Macron. And I think him being here also it's a sign that he does support the summit here. He may have issues as it relates to the war in Ukraine. I think the war in Ukraine, again here, might be a sticking point because France is fully behind Ukraine. When other countries are saying, let's also listen to what the Russians are saying. South Africa is saying that it's saying, don't be biased. Let's listen to all sides. So France would have issues when you look at the declaration as it relates to global peace, but it will not be a stumbling block. But I'm trying to say France is quite important. But the fact that President Macron is in South Africa, he didn't even send a representative. He's here in person. It speaks to how the French are viewing this forum and supporting the forum. And of course, then it will depend on the engagements.
And how, to what extent is South Africa an ally of the French when you consider that in former colonies, parts of the continent that it previously colonized, there is a strong anti-French sentiment in some of those countries? We're seeing increasing Russian influence, perhaps to a lesser extent Chinese influence as well?
South Africa is exporting lots and lots of citrus fruits to France, including important issues such as much as we know that the French and the wine, they are the brand, but you do get that. So in terms of trade and investment, there's quite a lot that South Africa and France are working on, but you'd recall that the late Minister Natim Tetwa was hoping to strengthen the trade relations. We saw the Deputy President Paul Mashatile going to France to engage with the business there to strengthen trade relations as a counter to the tariffs, the US tariffs, to say if we lose this market, our business community must have another alternative, and you boost those trade volumes. And France is a better destiny in terms of that, including tourism. You know that you get many tourists from Europe, from countries such as United Kingdom, Germany, and France. And therefore, you have an ally in terms of strengthening trade relations. As I pointed out, yes, the sticking point of the war in Ukraine, on the issue of France losing credibility on the continent, in the Sahel region, you know that Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, those countries are saying, we don't appreciate how France is conducting its business on the continent. And therefore, it is up to France to listen to those countries and see how they can mend the relations. But there's a cry coming from the Sahel region to say everything, even a toothpick, comes from France. We are capable, we can manufacture. And I think even on the issue of security, that you can't come and bully us. And therefore, I think President Macron will have to listen to that voice.
And what is interesting, by the way, as we continue to show you those pictures of French President Emmanuel Macron, we're not ignoring him. We're going to bring you an English translation as soon as we have it. While the positions between Paris and Pretoria are still divergent on Russia-Ukraine, the French are moving somewhat closer, aren't they, to the South African position on the Palestinian issue and the right to statehood for Palestinians. At the recent United Nations General Assembly, they led the charge in a recognition of an independent state for the people of Palestine.
You are correct. At the UN, we saw that conference. And I think for South Africa, it was a moment of relief. As you know, that South Africa has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice, but also International Criminal Court. And on the South Africa's actions in both institutions or courts, you are relieved that at least there are countries, they may not be with us in these processes, but at least they are agreeing that something must be done as it relates to the situation in Palestine. I spoke to the Egyptian Foreign Affairs Minister. I will bring you that exclusive interview. He talks about that. There's great progress in terms of the fact that he is indicating, and remember Egypt is a neighbor, that all hostages have been released. Those who died, the bodies were released. Now we must talk implementation. And therefore countries such as France, recognizing Palestine, you are getting a sense that something can be done, but it's still early days because Hamas has got concerns in terms of the rebuilding of Gaza, and the Egyptian diplomat also said we also have to take into consideration the concerns of those stakeholders in that part of the world. But you are correct, that decision to recognize Palestine, it is indeed a relief for South Africa to see that at other levels there's movement. Because South Africa, we know that it recognized Palestine long time ago.
I want to get an indication, we're getting visuals of one of the leaders arriving on these aircraft, getting off his ride for the G20 Summit. There you go. It's one of the Middle Eastern or the Gulf delegations then being received. Tonight we're receiving two leaders, namely the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi from the United Arab Emirates. That's Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. We're also expecting in the next few minutes the arrival of MBS, that's Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, two of the most powerful countries in the context of the Middle East and the Gulf, which Sophie and I were actually just talking about as far as Gaza, Israel. And as recently as this week, we saw MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in Washington, where President Trump basically shielded him from a question about the killing a few years ago of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist. And now here he is in the country. This is, I believe, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, who has just arrived. So we can confirm that is who we are seeing now in these pictures.
Well, I think it's important to see these leaders from the Middle East. Earlier on, I want to return back to that interview because it gave me such huge, important...
The Egyptian interview.
Yes, context. You know, they will be hosting a pledging conference for Gaza or Palestine. And therefore, these countries are going to play a very important role during that pledging conference because they have resources. And he was saying that they expect the international community and the regional organization, you know, the Arab League, to play a more prominent role in bringing together these resources. He also even divulged that they have invited South Africa to this pledging conference that's likely going to happen very soon. And again, you see that synergy, even on the Middle East question. And again, these leaders are likely going to meet at the pledging conference.